My name is Davida Ingram, and I'm so excited to spend time with you for the next 45 minutes. I always like feeling out my audience. So raise your hand if you are someone who's involved with the performing arts. All right, lots. Okay, so I'm hanging out with the performing arts people. How about literary arts? Visual arts? Arts unknown to others. Possible? Possible? Alien art is what I'm all about. I normally, when I introduce myself, I explain that I am a writer who went to art school. And so, in a way, I'm someone who creates books, poems, but in a gallery installation format. And I think my medium of choice is community. So I care an awful lot about the people that I'm connected to. And I also consider deeply what it means to be preoccupied with community. Because when you're preoccupied with community, you care about the gifts that people bring. I'm almost 40, so I'd probably say I've spent almost as long as I know being someone who isn't artistically inclined. And I'm feeling nostalgic because I've lived in Seattle for the last 10 years. And I came home recently for my baby sister's wedding. And weddings are, they're momentous occasions. I come from a family where quite often funerals are our family reunions. So to come together when something good is going down feels really nice. But of course, because I've lived in the Pacific Northwest and most of my family lives in the Midwest and specifically Chicago, when I come home, I notice different things. Because as I get closer to 40, my parents had me when they were about 30, so that means that they're sliding into their 70s. And I kind of tend to think in recent historical terms. So I'm someone who grew up on hip hop, and I think hip hop, like jazz, is America's one of our original art forms. And I also think about it as a particular kind of pastiche that came together from the ways that Black families were broken up in the post civil rights era. So when I come home, my dad lives in veterans housing. And if you know me, a lot of my stories are about my dad because he has a way with words, and I'm a writer, so I think I crib from him often. But I noticed that his life is a lot different from mine. He has access needs, so he stays in his studio apartment, and he recently had a stroke. And I was just noting when I came home that there were some things that I know about community that I needed to bring into the home space. So just really simple things, like I asked him, Dad, do you know that the library will probably bring audiobooks to you? Because when I was younger, he got hit by a car, and it herniated all the disc in his back. And he was a Black man who modeled himself on Shaft, so like wheelchairs don't really go with his aesthetic. So he's decided to live with a lot of chronic pain. But in working with my dad and seeing the way his access needs affect and change his life and being further away from him, I just see those things when I come home. I think art has taught me a lot about love in the grander sense of things, because when you're an artist, I'm an artist that is engaged in social practice. But when I go home, I see sometimes that intimacy, that ability to love up close, is something that I will continually work on, because I think love is, it's a discipline in and of itself, and it's probably our highest callings, in my opinion. I'm going to show you some of my work. And the reason why I called us down to be closer to one another is that I'm hoping that we will get a chance to do something that was embedded in one of my projects, which was talking about dreams. I see myself as a dreamer, someone who thinks pretty hard about what it is that I'm envisioning in the world, and as a visual artist who also is inclined to words, and I think words are magic. With our words, we bring things to life. I am always wondering what is the type of world that I'd like to be living in. So in a moment, and I want to make sure my friend Mike is ready because I have him doing some extra work with us. In a moment, we're going to watch a small segment of a video that I created in collaboration with a really amazing Seattle-based photographer and cinematographer named Inye Wakoma, and an incredible drone operator. named Marcus Exo Anderson. And I work in a lot of different mediums. So I've worked with drone operators, hypnotists, community members. A lot of the times in my art practice, I move around quite a bit. But in this particular video, I was thinking about how do you show the dream of Black women moving through time and space without being constrained by all the different laws that have dehumanized us over time. So if you think about Davida Ingram, are there other women of African American descent in this room? All right. So thinking about us, if we moved the clock back, if we were in DC in 1955, would we be in this room? If we move it back to 1855, what would our experience look like, and so on. So this video kind of takes a look at the cityscape of Seattle because Seattle's in the process of being reimagined in ways that terrify me. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but for now, let's just watch a little bit of the video. All right. The video's gonna fade out in a little bit. If you were enjoying the sound check, because I'm thinking of my folks who said that they were from the performing arts, that composition came from a Seattle-based musician named Ahamafale Aluo. When I got a chance to work on that video, there were many different things that were on my mind. One in particular was telling myself, Davida, for quite a bit of time, you've been doing a lot of art that is, in a way, pretty didactic. And I wanted to move into a space of reverie. So one where perhaps I didn't have to spell out my social justice values with everything that I was working on. But a funny thing happened with that particular piece. I had an all-Black crew, which is kind of rare in Seattle, especially considering I had a drone operator. So I'd spent, I think in my life as an artist, I've always been someone who put projects together, so I tend to be a talent scout. And I had put out feelers because I knew that I wanted to do shots inside of the historic King Street station in Seattle, which is kind of a port of call in a way. So earlier when I asked if there were African American women in the audience, one of the reasons why I asked that is because in that piece, we shot it in a train station. And for a lot of African Americans, like many other cultures that have migration histories, and I think that's a pretty universal order, our people move from the South north on the train lines. And so that space felt particularly resonant with me. Later on in my presentation, you're going to see the other women that were joining that woman who stood on the ledge looking at the changing cityscape and that 360-degree view. One of the things that I was thinking about when I had Eve, who's the first face that you see in the video, stand in the front, is that often in white supremacist culture, we have genetically modified beauty. And what I mean by that is we have prettiness, but we don't have beauty. And beauty is something that is diverse, and it never takes just one form. And as a Black woman who's dark-skinned, And when I go home, I often think about the role I played in my family. We're kind of like the seven bean soup version of blackness. So I have a Sade colored older sister, a younger sister who's more Beyonce colored, and I'm very dark skinned. I also grew up being the favorite in my family, so there was a role reversal in my family that I think is not typical in black families. So I grew up being loved because I was dark-skinned and adored because I was dark-skinned, which was actually really hard for my older sister who's very fair. And thinking about the choice of putting the woman who played the focal figure in that video was very intentional on my behalf because we don't often get a chance to look with adoring eyes on dark-skinned, fuller-figured black women. Or when we do it with caveats. So you're beautiful for a, and I was thinking, how do we create a space where someone is just simply beautiful? One of the things that struck me about that particular piece, and it leads me to the image of the clouds that you see, is that there was a miscommunication between the person who gave me access to King Street Station and the Amtrak below, which is owned by Homeland Security. And I'm an activist. I do a lot of stuff around Black Lives Matter. And somehow or another, within the miscommunication, someone had decided that I'd probably had a protest. And I was thinking, that must be the most opaque ass protest in the world, like with black women in beekeeper veils with no signs. Like I was like, man, you have me on some upper level stuff. But in any case, we ended up having an exchange, and I was thinking, well, isn't this ironic that when I think I'm not being political, I'm forced in a political space, which actually clarified some of my thinking around when and where I become a political person, because I think sometimes we're political, not because we want to be, but because that's what society asks of us. So getting back to blue sky moments, being able to strip out social context is important to me.
All right.
As
I
is the
like your
notion
thoughts.
of being able to, I am going to mute that because there's a narration that I don't want to play. But thinking about the space of a dreamer. I'm someone who's had dreadlocks for a really long time. You can't tell because I've cut my hair a lot. But as a black woman with curly textured hair, and overall that kind of prefers straight hair, I started to notice on social media that there were moments amongst my black friends, because I think this is an internal conversation for the most part, where there would be snide remarks were made about black women who would go out in public with their hair bonnets on. And because it's just been a while since I've straightened my hair, it wasn't something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I live in Seattle, and we just live in a much smaller population because I think race is geopolitical in a way. So I grew up in Chicago, which is, at the time when I lived there, was about 40% black. In Seattle, black people are about 12% of the population. But as I logged onto Facebook, I would hear friends who'd be like, oh, I know she didn't go outside with their hair bonnet on. And it made me really reflective about what the hair bonnet could be as a metaphorical symbol. So on one level, I think, what does it take to protect black women's psyches in a world where all the beauty constraints that we live within go against us, and to imagine differently. So in this particular photo, I went for a really classical repose, and I worked with a photographer named Zorn B. Taylor to work on this with me. But then also to have a moment of thinking about what it means for a woman to sit with soul. Like many black women in society, I've had different spaces where there's another black woman who's approximate to me. She's 5'2", she's a deep brown skin, she has natural hair, and we'd be mistaken for one another. And in this particular scene, I thought, well, what would it be like to not resist it, to go with it? So I went and sought out someone who doesn't really look like me, if you're looking, but looks approximate to me. And we decided to kind of choreograph this scene where I'm imagining having a space of looking, being able to look outside of myself. So I'm the figure that you see in the foreground. But then also to have a space where you confront yourself. Because like most artists, I think, in a way, and it sounds kind of naive, but I feel what artists do is they show you your heart. They show you their heart, and they want you to think about how you feel. So kind of moving forward, This is me going back to King Street Station and wanting to show you what it's like to be able to have access to something that exists in the public sphere that's iconic and to own it as someone who's often outside of the social contract. So as we move inside, you can see that when you get all the way to the top of King Street Station, there's a room on the inside that's all white. And when you see that room, it has a spiral staircase that leads all the way to the top, but you pass these clocks as you go. So when I first got a chance to look at that room, it was because there was an art fair that was happening in Seattle, and I had been invited to participate. And as soon as I saw that room, I knew I wanted to do something in there. I'm a critical thinker, but oftentimes my visual imagery is very automatic. It's my unconscious communicating with me, and I like that the unconscious is wordless. So it's your job to understand those images and give them form. But I knew that I wanted to come back to that space. So I ended up producing another project. And that project is much less dreamy. That project was called Where Can My Black Ass Go to Be Safe? And I'm a process-based artist. So with that particular piece, I invited friends and people who I had recently met to come over and take a picture of me bent over prone, and then answer the question, where can a Black woman go to be safe? And I did that right after Sandra Bland had been murdered. And after doing a piece that was heavy like that, I wanted something a little bit lighter. So when my unconscious downloaded the image of Black women dressed in white going up that staircase, I was really seduced by it and decided to work with it. So this is just the image as we cut away from the woman from the outside of the women walking up the stairs. So if you happen to visit Seattle, King Street Station was recently remodeled. So that last still that we end on is what it looks like to stand amongst the columns and that really, really bright, striking white background. Now, I know in racialized society, we think of whiteness in racialized terms. When we get past white supremacy, we'll have a different way of relating to the color white. A lot of times in my work, I think about the duality of opposites and what it means to hold the tension between challenging racism and wanting to dismantle it, and at the same time knowing that as I erase those structures, what I don't want to erase is that deep history that was created in my country, or to do the thing that Americans often do, which is to be incredibly narcissistic and to only think about ourselves. I think often what it means for me, especially as we look at the theme of a citizen artist, for me to see myself as a global citizen. So while I very well know that the people who were kidnapped from Africa represent one of the largest migrations of people from one place to another, that as we move past the construct of race to understand what it means to trust in one another as humans, that it doesn't mean dismantling that history or forgetting it. So I'm gonna do, and I'm almost done with my presentation, so we're gonna get to a point where we're gonna have a conversation. Are you all okay with that? Are we good being interactive? You feel like you're gonna have questions? I'm definitely having questions that I'm gonna throw out to you. I'm gonna do a technology switch because I want you to understand this image. And I also felt like in this presentation, I wanted to explore, hold on for 1 second. I wanted to explore a little bit more, but in a very condensed way, the way I work as an artist. Oftentimes I work with inquiry making. So for example, in 2005, I was in grad school at Bard College, and I got a scholarship, and I was very excited to leave Chicago. I'd been running an independent media center in like I guess my mid-20s, like 2026. And I got burnt out, and I decided that grad school would be much easier than running a small independent media center. So I took off to grad school. And one of the things that I realized immediately, that even though I got a scholarship, the way I thought and participated in the notion of art ran against the grain of the school that I was accepted in. And I found myself, like a lot of the young people that I talk to when I go visit colleges and do artist talks, feeling alienated from the cultural milieu that I was part of. And that breakdown for me, because it really was a moment of sadness and despair, also became a place where I reinvented myself. So I started wondering, what if, instead of completing this thesis, Davida, you just wrote highly imaginative Craigslist ads? So I wrote an ad that said, because I was really interested in talking about why there were no women of color in my curriculum, but I realized every time I explicitly brought up race, it incited a defensiveness that exhausted me. So I decided I wanted to find a way to have a conversation about race and gender without bringing it up. So my first experiment in that particular path was creating a Craigslist ad that had the title, "Come Hungry." And it said, "Black woman willing to make meal for white man. You bring the ingredients, I'll prepare, come hungry." And that became a private performance piece, because race is, after all, something that we do both in public and in private. And from doing that project, both in New York and Seattle, I realized the different ways that Blackness is shaped. So I started that project in the Northeast. Moving it to the Pacific Northwest made it very different. But when I moved the project to Seattle, I realized I was less interested in picking the brains of white men to see if they could imagine me, but much more interested in making sure that I had connections to other people of color, and women of color in particular. So the image that you're looking at on the screen is of a recent collaboration I had with a composer and vocalist named Hannah Ben. Hannah is an incredible soprano. And we got a chance to work together on a piece where I was creating a narrative that was about imagining why I stopped crying. And I started having sessions with a hypnotist who would take me back to my unconscious and ask me what it was that my unconscious was protecting me from. Because we're built for survival. And your unconscious, as my hypnotist explained to me, doesn't have a past or a future. It just lives in the present. So if there's something that hurts you deeply, it's going to be there to try and make sure you don't have that fall again. And as we worked on that piece, the story actually ended up unfolding to a story about my mother. And I'm queer identified, so I date across the spectrum, but for my mom, it's incredibly confusing for her when sometimes I date men when I tell her that I'm queer, because she wants grandbabies and she's just stuck in that place. But as I worked on this piece with Hannah, I realized I wanted a dyadic figure that could be romantic, that could be familial, that could be platonic, and that I needed something that could cradle that emotion of being on the cusp of tears, since that was what I was working on in the piece. And also along the way, I was dealing with the notion of surrogacy. So because me and my mother had a pretty fraught relationship, one of the things that gave me refuge was the really tight bond I had with my father's mother, who was maternal in all the ways that I craved. And in the process of moving to Seattle, I happened to get into a romantic entanglement, because those happen in your 20s, where I was a bit distracted. And when I decided that I would come home after all the chaos of my romance was over, I decided I would surprise my grandmother for Mother's Day, and it happened to be the weekend that she passed. So she had been struggling with cancer, and I'd been checked out. So that piece was my reckoning with different types of grief. So I'll do a technology exchange, but we'll get a chance to listen to Hannah, and also a really incredible actress who's now in Los Angeles, but used to live in Seattle, named Rachel Ferguson. So give me a second. Out of that reverie and back to the boy. That's a really beautiful performance. I was kind of laughing because Hannah and I, the Citizen Artists, are going to work a lot on collaboration. And when I was working with Hannah, because I'm a visual artist, I was seeing things that she just didn't see. So she didn't want to do the video. And I was thinking, being able to hold that type of emotion and to have things be incredibly simple, because I think you've really gotten to a sweet spot when something that's hard to do looks easy. And so I kept wanting to go, oh, apparently she wants to keep singing to us. But I wanted to be able to hold on to that space that emotion holds for us, especially because for me, when I think of survival in America, especially as an African American, I think often that the space of Black oratory, Black music, Black writing it's been intrinsically woven into our survival. And that's something that I'm a student of. I was telling Vanessa when we were getting ready that this was a trippy weekend for me, because just when I was kind of starting to scratch the surface of wrapping my mind around Prince not being here, Beyonce dropped Lemonade, which I was just like, okay, so now I'm grieving and wonder and holding on to all these different emotions, because as the Black American songbook has gone through a space of cultural fermentation, I think the way we look at Black artistry and music has been changing tremendously. And I don't think it's the scary thing. Like, I just went to my sister's wedding and we like totally shut it down on the dance floor dancing to trap music, because I was like, we're gonna dance to I'm in Love with the Coco. And people were just like, what? And I was like, yes, we need to dance to I'm in Love with the Coco, because that's part of being together. But I've been thinking tremendously about what it means to be a classically trained Black artist, and then also to be someone has a culturally diverse diet. So within Blackness, we know that there's no one way to do it. There are 40 million of us, and we'll do it in individual ways. But to create space in my artistic practice to bring Black creativity together, and also to put Blackness in conversation with other people of color. as much as I want to challenge white supremacy, I often find that I'm also recentering it by not focusing on my connections with other people of color. So when I describe myself as someone who is part of the northern migration, because my family came from Arkansas to Chicago, I lay out that lineage because I want to be connected to undocumented immigrants who are also understanding their paths in America through migration and displacement, through roots and routes. This is my mom. I'm getting ready to wrap up, and then we're going to have questions. And the questions, just so I can plant a seed, because I've told you I'm someone who sees myself as a dreamer. So when I get done, I'm going to ask you to talk to folks next to you about 2 questions. What is your dream? And how has your dream survived? And also what you think might be destroying dreams. So not just your dreams, but anybody's. So I want us to have space to talk, so I want to kind of quickly wind this down, but it's also at a point that's personal for me. So as you can see, I look a lot like my mother. And I was thinking, I was like earlier today when we have Maria from Sesame Street, because I grew up on Sesame Street, when she talked about her family going through legacies of domestic violence, I thought a lot about what a personal story that is and one that's really hard to tell. And I think about the way that violence has functioned in my family and what part is my story to tell. And what I can say about that is looking at the struggles that my mom went through when I was a little girl, it was often hard for me to look so much like her and to have her struggle so hard with the relationship that she was in. And eventually she and my dad ended up separating from one another, which was tough on me because I'm actually in the middle of working on a piece with her about this. But I was my dad's favorite, and then when he left, I had a very strained relationship with my mother. What's been beneficial to us is that because I no longer live in Chicago, we have a little bit of distance and like an aerial view similar to the one that I showed you in the video, where we can look at each other differently. But I snapped this shot of her on my cell phone as I was waiting to be at my sister's wedding. And in my family, the relationship with my dad is so strained that my dad was not invited. And I told my younger sister, hey, look, I'll be there to support you, but I can't be in your wedding party. And we just came to an understanding. That was hard, but we figured it out. But sitting next to my mother, I just had a moment of just looking at her face and realizing she's so gorgeous to me. Absolutely beautiful, and being able to appreciate all of her strength, all of her wisdom, and her ability to move past pain. Because some things that I'm metabolizing, she's moved past. She doesn't need to process anymore. And so I just had a moment of really deep admiration. But I also feel like I come from a space, I believe in transformative justice and I believe in restorative justice. So when I talk about my dad's history of violence, I do not want that to be the only thing that he's seen as. There's a biography that I could share where I say I was raised by a single mother on the south side of Chicago. I was one of 5. But if I started in that place, the stories that people would say about me would not reflect the richness of my life, nor would it reflect the richness of the man who raised me, to think of myself as beautiful and capable and competent. So when I took this portrait of my father, my brother joked that my dad looked like he was about to drop the illest mixtape of 2016. And I was like, I kind of like that idea of thinking about hip hop growing up and the generation that came before. So in wrapping up, this is an image from an earlier series I did called I Wish a Motherfucker Would. So those questions that I asked you to talk about, what is your dream? How has your dream survived? For me was a site-specific installation where I asked communities that are often in struggle to think about their dreams and to have a conversation. And because I'm a bit of a control freak, I didn't want the performance to be documented in the space that it happened in, so we did a photo shoot before. My practice is also designed to help us see the artists of color who make Seattle come alive for me, because Seattle is seen as a really white city, but within that whiteness is also a lot of brownness and a lot of complexity. So the people who are featured in here include a Palestinian rights activist, that's the woman who's reclining on the floor. The woman who's sitting next to the cotton is a woman who is a cisgender ally for trans women of color and often talks about the way trans women of color are being murdered. Next to her is Rachel, who you saw earlier in the video with Hannah Ben, the composer. And then right next to them, I didn't do my slide right because his head is cut off, is a really incredible composer and musician named Evan Flory Barnes. So through my work, I try to do documentation that moves beyond the constraints of conventional documentary work. And I do it as a media producer. Along the way, I look at schisms between my imagined world and the one that I live in. So throughout I Wish a Motherfucker Would, we ask people to say what they wish motherfuckers would do. So in this case, this is someone who's saying, I wish a mofo would read, research, inquire, and teach others what they know. So we ended up with this really amazing archive. Oh my God, it's just 5 minutes. I have to shut up. Oh my gosh, that went so much faster than I thought. I'll shut it down so we have time for questions. I'm so sorry, you all let me talk so long. I should have wrapped it up a lot earlier. Okay. Do you all want to ask questions in our last 5 minutes? I feel really sheepish now because I talk too much, like super sheepish. Thank you. Go for it.
Well, next year, I'm graduating this year from high school, and I'm born and raised here in DC, and I'm moving to Boston because I'm going to Boston University, and I'm going to major in acting. And while DC, well, it's not so much of a chocolate city, but I'm going to Boston where it's like not a chocolate city at all. And I would just like some suggestions for young people of color who also want to make art. Um, and like, yeah, what you've learned throughout your journey and any suggestions you have for students.
Okay, so what I heard was for a talented young woman of color who's moving from one place that's melanin rich to a place that might be different, what are some good things to think about and do? I would probably say for myself, if I could go back 20 years, actually a little bit more than 20, to when I went to college, learning to be resourceful. I was incredibly shy, and I also didn't think that I was that talented. So it took me a while, actually until I got into my 30s before I really started pursuing art with the passion that I have now. But I led a really sheltered life, but being resourceful, having a mentor, and also having really different mentors, so people who are willing to push you and ask you to move into different spaces, and also getting out of your comfort zone. I think my biggest critique of my younger self, and I do it with love, was that I think I was much too afraid to try the new world out that I've participated in because I wanted the safe confines of Blackness. And it was actually my dad who taught me that the world was not going to be all Black and that I needed to be able to exist in every portion of it and be comfortable. Another question?
I love it's a great presentation, thank you, and really enjoyed the way you kind of, in the way you describe your process, is kind of shifting away from the didactic and into other ways of looking at problems. How do you articulate the kind of impact of that? Because we see a lot of the time we're held to this measure of, how many, what's the social benefit? It's got to be measurable and it's got to be kind of quantified. And so how do you talk about the kind of impact of your work when you locate it and start creating it in ways that don't necessarily lend them to that kind of measurability?
How do I, so I want to repeat the question. So how would I measure the value of my work? I don't give a fuck about standardized tests. It definitely won't be that measured. But I do think, and I think it's good to question paradigms because human knowledge is very confined by what we don't know. And we are a species that often is so confident that we know. So being in that space of curiosity is one thing. So I'm often surprised by what people see in my work, and I like being open to it. But I also think one of the most meaningful things that happens for me is when people pull me aside, and oftentimes it's women of color who say, thank you so much for giving me a representation. That's really different than what I would get if I consumed like primarily popular culture, because we just, even with Beyonce dropping Lemonade, I'm like, she could do 5 more albums just like that and we still wouldn't have a rich enough palette. So I think those sorts of things matter to me a lot. Of course, reviews help. It's nice to have someone who really gives you a decent review of your work. In Seattle, I wish we had more art critics, but I also think having people, I was trained in cultural criticism, so I often encourage artists to figure out who's going to write about your work and push you into avenues that are more dynamic. Do we have time for 1 or 2 more questions? Just 1. Thank you, Vanessa. Go for it.
In the first video you showed of at the train station, what was the idea of the beehive hat thing? I don't know
The
what it's
beekeeper
called. Yeah, the
veils.
beekeeper veils. Yeah.
So the question was, what was the metaphor that I was working with the beekeeper veils? I'm really interested in notions of the divine feminine, and I think in terms of thinking about matriarchal cultures, but also challenging notions of hierarchies, I ended up kind of thinking about the way hives work. So that building looked like a hive to me a little bit. But I also think when you look at the history of honey and how it's been husbanded, like the way we've learned how to collect and produce honey, made me wonder, what is the life of a queen bee like? And I like that we think of queen bees as symbols of female power, but also ones that are really problematic. The queen bee doesn't get to go anywhere, but also if she's not functioning, the hive collapses. Or if you're a beekeeper, you might extinguish your queen bee if she's not producing enough. So thinking in metaphorical terms about what are different symbols of female power that could be used in ways that are also kind of light-handed too. I also like the way the gesture and flow of those veils work. So they also looked like, in a way, like brides. Thank you.